Brothers, welcome to the Finished Man podcast, where we discuss the journey of manhood, not only the formation of boys to be men, but also what it takes for young men to grow into fuller manliness. And what we want to do here, we want to get to the heart of the tougher issues. And of course, we want to move into more concrete steps and solutions. This is Dr. Phil Chavez, and I'm joined with Chuck Harvey. Chuck, it's good to be here. And I look forward to this podcast and all that'll come from it. So,
Yeah, Phil, thanks for having me again. Well, I thought maybe I would start out with I hope it's not a curveball. A very basic question is, when we say the finished man, and I know we'll dig into it very deeply throughout all this podcast, but what does that basically mean?
Well, first of all, when I think of other possibilities and titles, it just sounds good. The finished man. You can say complete man or total man, or I don't know what else you'd say, right? But a finished man sounds like there's something complete, and it sounds like it's a word also. It means as men, they always want to arrive at a certain point. We want to know what that finish line is. And so it sounds very polished in the sense of talking about the total man. But that's it. We want to talk about what it takes to make for complete manliness. And I think in my own perspective, and this isn't to be too critical, but in other men's apostolates, I don't think we take into account the fuller man. And the man that's, his full spiritual nature and his full human nature, how that they complement each other and how they move together and how we can form in that. And so we want a finished man by which we could speak about all those things on the level of nature and the level of grace. Right. So I think that's the best way I could sum that up.
And is it something that could be accomplished in this life, or are we always striving toward it?
Yeah, that's a good question, because even the sense of like Aristotelian perfection, to be perfect means we're just in act. In other words, as long as we're in motion to the right direction and acting the way we're supposed to be and even growing, we could say we're increasingly growing perfect, you could say. I know in our sense, a lot of times we think, well, perfection is just, some level you stop at, you just coast from there. Not really. Perfection is where, yes, I guess maybe you do reach to a certain level, but you keep growing in that level. So yeah, there's always augmentation, in the earthly journey. And of course, in some faculties, they diminish a little bit, but others perfect, and so physically as men, we will diminish a little bit. And so certain things that go along with that will be, you could literally say we're less of a man in terms of less of a warrior, but intellectually and morally, in terms of intellect and will, we should be perfecting ourselves. Yeah. And in heaven, actually, there's always, the saints teach that there's always an increased perfection level in heaven. So I look forward to that, where we actually grow in greater, perfections in who we become, greater in glory too.
So why do you think this is, for you, like you personally, why do you think it's important to focus on this topic?
I was recently inspired by a man who wrote me a text talking about the disintegration of young men. And every now and then I get those. And every now and then you see, these posts at different forums talking about, the wounded nature or the unfinished nature of the young man today. And it's very, very painful, because even in my own church, which is filled with a lot of very conscientious Catholic young men, the scary thing is, even though they may be following their faith, a lot of the young guys are still lost. I mean, it's interesting when I ask them, which is my favorite question to ask a young man, is what are you passionate about? The majority, 60% plus, say, well, I don't know. Well, what are you aiming toward in life? Well, I'm still trying to figure that out. So I find that problem, which has to do with maybe some of their interests or a vocation in life, or what they plan to do professionally, even though that may not be figured out, there are some deeper things going on here. You could just tell, just by the blank stares you get, kind of the empty answers, and kind of the vacuous kind of appearance of young men today, where there's, not to be too critical, but sometimes they seem like an empty shell inside. There's something like deeply lacking. And of course, it's not something physically so much. Actually, in some ways there could be. But I find that the men today are just, they're greatly lacking in some kind of substantive identity and mission. And I think part of that is I think part of that is because, they've grown up in a skeptical age where there's less truth and less certitude about things. I think even when we were growing up, I think the age was kind of skeptical as well. We didn't hold any certain truth, or there was kind of an educational mantra that there wasn't any certain truth. However, now it's gone to an even worse level and a more confusing level, where it seems to be opinion reigns, and so men kind of don't know where they stand. And I think what happens when they're lost on the level of nature, they will also be lost on a level of supernature. Even though, so their supernatural identity will in some way be compromised as well. So they want to be, we're supposed to be identified as a beloved son of man, a beloved son of God. And I think it's very hard if you can't establish yourself as a beloved son of man in your own human nature. It's going to be otherwise very hard to achieve what it is to be a beloved son of God.
Right.
I think there's a lot of struggles there for a lot of young men.
Interacting with high school boys every day, I find it's almost like, I would describe it as they have such a focus on egalitarianism that they've lost their distinctiveness.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. They don't know exactly. In other words, if we're all the same, I'm the same as the girls, and even to the point
Yeah.
like, well, I shouldn't hold the door for them. They're struggling with. So what am I?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that happens there is more and more is their culture that surrounds him. It's more and more androgynous. More and more do the girls get mixed in. Where we were growing up, I think there were more boy-to-boy games and enterprises and associations. Now, young men seem to be always around women in everything that they do. And what happens, is my opinion, but I hold it very strongly, is that when that goes on and there's women so mixed in, that androgynous enterprise eventually defaults into the feminine. So the boys will even be more lost. And so what you'll find is the boys will take on feminine characteristics and the girls will take on actually masculine characteristics more and more. And so you find them leading and the boys following. So I think insofar as they're in an ambient that's been very much touched by the feminine, I think that the masculine element and nature of them somewhat degenerates and gets lost.
Is there any precedent for this in history that you know of? Like, it just seems like I often think that like somehow this is a unique time, but then I sometimes think everyone thinks their time is unique. But what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is a unique time because I can't help but think in some ways we live in the most corrupt intellectual age it's ever been. In other words, just that whole problem of skepticism not really being any real certain truth, because I don't think, my studies of history, which are somewhat limited, I don't see any point in history where people thought that way. They may have been mistaken about what they thought, but at least they believed in certain truths and truths could be held, and that there were certain goods to be upheld as well. So I think there was focus there. But I think one of the things that keeps men somewhat limited in their ability to reach their identity in a healthy mission is more and more they be led away from work. And work is what forms a man. It helps him grow and mature. And in the professionalistic age we're into today, and deferring what it is to be a husband and father, more and more is that those states in life being more and more remote for a man. Most men in their younger 20s don't really aspire to be fathers, as far as I can tell, and the majority. And I find that without that kind of navigation, ultimately to become a husband and father, which is in some way a primal vocation, a man will lose his way. Because I think those are the only things that really mature him. I mean, other things he could do, he can gain discipline and grow in virtue in certain things, and that's all good. But at the end of the day, what really matures a man, very simply, is that he's on a quest to be a husband and a father. And of course, every priest should be formed that way too. And just like every girl should be formed to be in some way a wife and a mother. In other words, if that's not at the forefront, there's going to be something lost in their training and their formation.
Right. Now, I mean, you and I met, through a men's ministry, and in my whole experience of the last, I guess, dozen years being really re-involved in the church, there's all kinds of men's ministries out there. There's all kinds of books. There's all kinds of things about what it takes to to be a man, to step up in the world. What's your take on all that, or what approach do you think we should be taking to try to focus on this and solve this? I don't say solve this problem, but work on this.
Yeah, it's a multifaceted approach. I guess one of the things that I find, the reason I want to do this podcast more and more, because I think it's important to get a little deeper into some of the spiritual elements and the natural elements in the formation of man, which I think are missing a lot of men's apostolates. So, for example, on the spiritual level, what I find is a lot of men's apostolates operate somewhat on a natural level, where two things you're very much aware of. One is, well, first of all, they don't move out of identity. It's more about what you do. So there's a lot of virtue talk, right, in a lot of men's ministries. And it's a lot about, well, you can't be a good Catholic or Christian unless you're disciplined and all the rest. Well, there's two things I want to answer to that I think are highly lacking, what I could tell in men's ministries. The first is they don't establish the identity as a beloved son, through which I think men need to move out of. And again, that's the foundation of all things, right? The beloved son, the natural, the supernatural level. But there also is not much of a movement in faith. And so it's more about doing. And so in the Christian journey, it's faith which is the most meritorious thing, or definitely at the outset. Like, it's faith which moves mountains. It's faith which makes you whole. By your faith, you will be healed. As you have faith, so it will be given to you. So the journey of faith and journey of the supernatural virtues, I don't think is being taught. Now, on the other hand, again, on the natural virtues, it seems to me a lot of the movements that are in terms of formational base for men, both youth and older men, again, they're based a lot on virtue, which is good, but those virtues need to be incarnated into what a man is called to. So, my template is, a man's mission is to be a leader, protector, provider, priest, prophet, and king. And so those are very basic things. And I think we need to see virtue in light of how we act out certain roles, because we just talk about virtue, it becomes very, very abstract and theoretical. So it seems to me that virtues, yes, they do need to be discussed, but what needs to be more discussed are things of that mission that I've just talked about, and things of their identity, which need to be in some way focused on. And so I think those are more primal things. They may be talking about discipline or acts of virtue, or even I think what's coming to be unintelligible for a lot of young men is the pursuit of the sacraments. Without these basics, even the pursuit of sacraments becomes, I don't know, it has no real foundation. And two, the sacraments, I find too, one of the things that I think is missing in a lot of Catholic development is we make sacraments the aim. And what I mean by that, the sacraments are more channels of grace. In other words, they're supposed to perfect our acts of faith. They're supposed to perfect our becoming a beloved son. They're supposed to be perfecting our relationship with God, right? And so we need to see those things as more as perfected, not just the goalposts that, hey, as long as the guy's going to mass on Sunday, as long as he's going to confession and he's receiving communion, and following the commandments, generally he's good. He's done what he needs to be. Well, no, there are more deeper things there. And so most Catholic men's ministry, in fact, I think just even what men experience in the church just stays on that level. And it becomes all about going to heaven someday and all the things you need to do to get there, instead of really being transformed in Christ, which we all deeply want.
Now, our development as men, our formation lasts our entire life. And so, I have an adult son and daughter, and in some ways I had a later reconversion. So I sometimes feel like I missed a certain opportunity when they were younger. But now, teaching young men, I get a fresh crop every year. Where do you begin? Like, what do I start to focus on with them? They're going to all be like 14 years old, to help them on the right path to becoming finished men.
Yeah, I think, of course, maybe I'm just stating the obvious, but I think it's important that you just be that finished man. Remember that we must become the change we want to see, right? And so we must become that change for which we could shine upon others. And so the more we can grow in that journey of perfection, being finished ourselves, that will touch other men. But I find too, as you know, you've heard in my own language, more of it becomes more and more as I move along in life and teaching about men's development, it becomes more and more identity based. And so the more you can work to speak out of kind of not just a heart for understanding your identity, but seeing the world shaped around who we are, and not how it needs to shape up so much, or how the things we can accomplish in doing it, but who we are in the midst of it. And so I think that's one of the more important lessons to give young men. But I think too, even again, when it comes to reaching out, even fatherhood, I can't help but think that a lot of that is simply based on faith too. In other words, again, as you have faith, so what will be done to you. And it's you're called to move mountains, and you do that mainly by faith. And so there's something about, I don't know, that faithful surrender to God, that when that's really made, then we can really shine in that. And so those are very foundational things. But again, I think too, with young men, that triad of being a leader, protector, and provider, deep down, all men want to be those things. And so a lot of men's formation and men's talk, I believe, should in some way circle around those three key roles. Because on the natural level, I think everything is built upon those three roles in terms of what a man is to do. And in some way, how a man is to live out his life too. And even his vocational state, no matter what vocation he stays in, even a single life, he's called to embrace leadership, protectorship, and providership. And so with a good anchoring of those, aside from a good anchoring of spiritual life, but with a good anchoring of those, he's less apt to ask what his mission in life is. Because if a man has the basics of his mission in life, then I believe that he could figure out, or not be so disturbed about, maybe the more refined parts of his mission in life, his particular mission, or even his vocation. Somehow we get those elements straight. I won't say necessarily that the rest takes care of itself necessarily, but I believe most of it can. But at least there's a context there to keep a man out of fear and security about his identity, who he is, and what he's called to do, so he can move peacefully into accomplishing those things, or more peacefully into accomplishing some of the more refined things he's called to, say his vocational state or whatnot, or his particular mission, some particular talent he must exercise in the church, or in society. Yeah, it all depends on the basics. I remember Jesse Romero, one time we were in discussion, and he was telling me he actually trained under Chuck Norris. And Chuck Norris often said, learn the basics well. Learn the basics well, which he repeated often. And so I can't help but think we learn the basics of manhood well, and the rest at least is on the way to falling into place, if not already there.
Right. And what are some of those things? What are some of the basic things that we should try to do with young men to help them to understand their purpose and understand their role in life? What experiences or?
What's interesting, the founder of the Scouts, Robert Baden-Powell, he thought, well, in his vision of forming boys, I guess the reason he wanted to use the word scout is because a scout was a very highly trained individual, right? Who could survive under the most difficult circumstances. So to be a scout just didn't mean you lit campfires and, knew how to put up tents and, cook burgers on an open fire. No, to be a scout, that was a big deal. Right. And even for, my uncle was a scout in World War II, and he wasn't allowed to carry a weapon. Wasn't allowed to carry a firearm. He was only allowed to carry a knife. And so that he forced him to be more cryptic behind enemy lines. And of course, you have to learn how to survive on your own and to do some very difficult things. And so, but I guess where I'm going to all this was scouting. That was one element to really learn the fine things. But he really believed that outdoor experiences, those camping survival experiences, formed a man for life. And it's true, I think, God placed Adam in a garden, and in that garden, he was to till the soil and to work that soil. And so there were some very primal things I think he was supposed to learn by just being a farmer and just working with the land. And of course, I'm sure he made his own hut, so to speak, or his own little dwelling, and set Eve up with her own little, I don't know, whatever she needed. But I think it was a lot of experience with nature was very, very valuable. But again, I think too, as well, as a man grows, certainly he needs to be formed amongst other boys, where he needs to be. There's a lot of individually training he needs from his father and mentor, but he needs group training as well. Men work naturally too in platoons as well. They like working in a band of brothers, and they like working in a big army too. And so there's ways you form men in different groups. For to be solo, to be in a platoon, to be in a bigger army of men. So he needs different forms to be formed as well. And I'm thinking too, also, as he gets older, one of the things boys grow into men, or even young boys, they want to learn skills. And so I remember, even as a young boy, I took a lot of pride in, sweeping the garage when I was about 4, so that responsibility or something about work, and learning how to do things at an early age. I was blessed. My father's a contractor, so I learned how to wield a hammer and a saw at very, very young. And those skills, they're not only good for dexterity and, mental acuity and all the rest, but they form you to do real things. And so when I grew up, when something broke around the house, we just figured out how to fix it, and so to learn some of those skills of work and to actually initiate men in work when they become 13, I think is vital. And I think one of the things that's happening today that's really harming young men is we're not giving them these forums to actually engage in real work today. We somehow think their work is to be just to get good grades and just to do well in piano class or guitar class and, in athletics. And by the way, let's just do a little work on Saturdays, chores around the house, and, you got dishes on Thursday night, that kind of thing. But I think a younger man, one of the reasons he gets lost is, by the time he's 18, we're supposed to say, hey, you're 19, son, you're a real man now. And part of becoming a real man is that he's engaged in work and he's become responsible, and that he's earned something for which he's responsible also in his spending. And that we're not teaching kids today. In fact, on the contrary, we're teaching them to borrow money. And then during spring break, just to have a great time. So there's more than that to becoming a man.
Yeah, I mean, I'm generalizing, but it does seem like my sense is that as each year goes by, the kids, I don't say they're soft. I mean, because there's tough kids in my school, and they play football, but you feel like sometimes you feel like they've never seen a screwdriver, right? Or they don't like the whole idea of like changing a tire or changing the oil of a car or fixing something that's broken. It's almost like, well, if something's broken, you just throw it away and somebody buys a new one. There isn't that sense of self-reliance to be, no, you can fix things. You can use your hands to, and at some point, if you're a husband or a father, you can fix things around the house and provide for your family by doing that. That's almost like a foreign concept.
Yeah, and I think I think what's happening is fathers. I think as much as young people don't have the opportunities today, I don't think fathers are very alert to giving their sons those opportunities. And two, what's happened today is, as well as I do, when we're growing up, our dads fixed things. They put on a new roof. They painted the house. If something needed fixing, or they fixed cabinets themselves. Now men tend to hire most of those things out. Now we were growing up too. The cars we worked on were a lot easier to work on. Gosh, I have an Altima, and I one of the headlights went out. I looked inside, I thought, oh my gosh, this is kind of beyond me. I mean, this is way too complicated in terms of just getting this thing out. Where in the old days, I remember, my Grand Torino, I was able to just, pop the thing out without a problem. And you just figured it out just by looking at it. Oh, okay, it's just this little, these things I got to unloosen and then lift this out. But things are a lot more difficult today. So I think we need to be more creative with boys on things that they could fix and try to do more around the house. I know there's something I think too where, the average guy today, I think maybe he was a little more worn out. He's a little more worn out today than our dads were in the past. And so I don't know. I think he has less patience and less time and less energy for a lot of these extra things. And maybe it's just a little bit easier. He thinks, well, I can hire this out and I can get some rest instead of doing it myself. And I know of a wealthy owner of a publishing house, and as a witness to his kids, he would always mow his own lawns and wash his own car when he could easily, farm that out to somebody else. But he did a lot of things himself. And he told me it was just mainly to be an example to my sons. And I thought that was pretty powerful.
So we've kind of talked about, one of the things we can maybe start to do with boys is focus more on training them or teaching them, basic skills, whether it be camping skills or basic cooking skills or, how to fix things. But unfortunately, a lot of kids are living in homes where there isn't someone around to show them that. So I guess, is this something that we need to all think about is as men to be responsible for young men that maybe aren't our direct child or grandchild, but we need to kind of be on the lookout for kids in the community that we can help to form.
So. Yeah. I think as a man's natural glory is when he not just leads others to salvation and the good, but that he's formed many men. I mean, every man, when he thinks about dying, I mean, he's going to want to leave behind him a legacy. And his legacy in some way will be, yes, the women he's protected and provided for, but in some way his greatest legacy will be the men that he's formed, right? The men that he's trained, the men that he's left some skills with. And so I think that's the way it used to be. Used to have men, fathers, more engaged in athletics, more engaged in the scouts, more engaged in a lot of things. And fathers work together. It's interesting. One of the things I'm seeing now a little bit more than times past too is there's a lot more infighting amongst groups of men that I don't think you had as much when we were our age. And I don't know, is it an immaturity factor? I don't know. So more and more our boys around these systems by which they don't see men working well together to train them. Of course, a lot of times the men are, being trained, or rather, I mean, when I was a kid, now I didn't last too long in the Boy Scouts only because there wasn't much of a program. It just got dismantled because there was really no leadership. But, the idea of having a woman involved in the Boy Scouts in terms of leadership, that would have been completely unintelligible. Whereas today now you have them heavily involved. And so part of a man's formation, I really believe, is to see men working together and forming other men, seeing them kind of bond together that way. It's a great witness to young men.
Well, as you know, I mean, I've been involved with Scouts for a while, and frankly, one of the reasons why more and more women have gotten involved because there was no men around. And it was always a frustration. And some of those women who've become, good scout leaders would say, well, I didn't want to do this. But it seemed like I looked around and I needed to find some place for my boy to be around other men, and there wasn't enough for the men alone to do it. And that's kind of where we are,
One of the interesting things is, though, and I don't mean, it's interesting. Women are kind of fascinating in their own domain. And what happens, women, when they put their mind to something, they become very committed. And so what happens is, I see this as a problem as, yes, they don't see men getting involved. They start getting involved, and then they start to dominate. Their aspiration is not to encourage other men, or at least in effect, what happens, they enter into these circles and then they kind of take over. And I'm thinking even roles in the church or roles in other things. Women, I think when they kind of habituate themselves to moving in something, they don't really want to leave it. And I'm not sure why. Maybe because they have a sense of commitment or something that's very deep in them, and they don't want to. Then it becomes hard to let men in that because their commitment becomes so strong that it's hard for men to enter into that. So I think That's part of a problem. That's not being disparaging about a woman's nature. It's an unfortunate element in one sense, in that effect where men get displaced. But it's an amazing thing about women because there's something about their nature that is so tenacious when it becomes about the good of their children and the children of others, which is
Right.
kind of beautiful on one level, but it can become a little domineering. And yeah, and that in the end, that may not be very healthy. I don't think it's very healthy for a lot of young men. And so in that way, yeah, yeah, men are kept from stepping up the way they should.
So I know you spent a lot of time thinking about this topic and contemplating it. So I guess where do we begin? And I know it's a big issue, you can't, but like what's the roadmap, or how do you see us? We are where we are right now in terms of our society, in terms of our world, in terms of our church. Where do we? How do we first of all not feel overwhelmed by it, and then
Yeah.
where do we start to try to make a difference?
Yeah, I think first of all, yeah, in order not to be overwhelmed, again, I'll repeat because it's not a small thing, is that we've got to learn how to surrender to God and just trust that Father, I'm just here to move with you, and I know that you will work with me, and I will work with you. We'll try to move in this together. And so is to stay out of fear so we could see clearly, because you can never see clearly in fear. But in terms of that big picture on how to form, it's a little bit scary in this sense, and this is to take confidence away, but it's in some way to add to what it is to be alert to formation, and that is this. When Pius XII talked about this in 1929, his December 31st document on the Christian formation of youth, he said, which is a very transforming section or paragraph for me, he said, "It is not sufficient to form a child for their eternal salvation alone." He said, every child, now I'm not speaking, now there is an Italian version in the original Latin, and so I'm not speaking out of that, but the best I recall in the English, he says, every child should be formed concertedly, intellectually, morally, physically, emotionally, socially, domestically, and I'm missing one. There's 7. Okay, so there's 7 areas of formation, and when I read that, it's like, oh, where's the manual for that? And so one of the sad things is there really is no manual for that. And I think what needs to be produced for parents are those manuals to help them see these different areas of formation and how they integrate. But in general, in raising a boy, and of course it also holds with a girl, is that I believe the elements that we try to complete in their natural and supernatural formation, it's important that we see them in some way working together, not confusing the two, but working them together and seeing how that they both in some way play a role for complete development. So one of the ways a parent, especially I've seen Christian parents, Catholic parents, make this grave error. In fact, I saw an interview today of a woman. It sounded really good, but she made a grave error. She says, well, it's just my job is just to get my children to heaven. Well, the problem with that, though, there's a multifaceted element of that problem. Our destination is ultimately going to be heaven. That's not get to heaven is not our mission, properly speaking. Our mission is to be in communion with the Trinity, and our mission is to be a light to the world. And so part of being that light to the world is to what it is to be a good father and to be a husband or a brother or whatnot. And to in some ways see all those roles as lived in Christ too, that he really lived actually on earth. So we have to see all things in Christ too. But again, it's so important to see the human and the spiritual as two realities, which some way are suffused. So a child doesn't grow up segmented as I remember I was very segmented. You went to school and there was your school life. You're with your buddies, they had nothing to do with your family, and you're in church, you went into church mode or something like that. And when I grew up, there wasn't much integration of the three. I remember too, my mom telling me or my parents, they had parent teacher meetings growing up, and I always it always like grated on my soul. What do you mean? Don't get near my teacher. I don't want you near my school. It's not because I was so embarrassed. It's just like, that's not where you belong. That's my domain. That's me. That belongs to me, not you. That's
Right.
my part of life. But parents need to kind of talk to their children in a way that's integrating everything, and to lead them such that they're integrated. Now, also too, as I mentioned before, one of the things I think is very, very important, and one of the key reasons I think we're losing youth in the faith, at least in terms of their primary mission. That mission at baptism is to be a priest, a prophet, and a king. A priest who sacrificed on behalf of others, which, by our prayers and offerings. The prophet who lives out the truth in word and deed, and the king who uses his gifts to build the kingdom of God. Now, I find that, well, first of all, most people don't even know what that means. I mean, I had a couple of degrees and graduate degrees in theology. I couldn't even have given you a good, intelligible, simple explanation of that. But I think what's important is that as a man learns those, he learns his role to be a leader, protector, and provider. In some ways, see that priest, prophet, and king is somewhat of a spiritual fulfillment of his being a leader, protector, and provider. And I think if we don't see priest, prophet, and king in some way as built upon that natural role, or at least seeing those two in some way together, there's something disconnected. And so I think that idea of manifesting those roles won't take the proper grounding, and they won't be accepted and received and carried out the way they should.
Now, what I'm seeing again, this is my experience right now, but I don't think it's unique. I think it's a microcosm of the broader society. Is every year when I get a new crop of young men and women in my classes, they're less and less churched. I mean, they don't even have a foundation about faith or Christ or religion at all. So you really are starting completely in the natural order
Yeah.
of things, and they're formed by our society.
Yeah.
Is there a difference in how you approach a group of kids that have no sense of Christ versus a group of kids who have at least heard the story or understand the basics of the sacrifice? And
Yeah, gosh, I wouldn't know how to start with that, but at least let me start this way, and then let's remind me of that
yeah,
question, because I think it's the case. One of the reasons that growing children, adolescents, lose a sense of the faith is because more and more have the parents and the priests kind of withdrawn from it. And so what's happening, we depend more and more upon schools and third-party educators, whether in catechism or whatnot from the church or whatnot. And fathers are not only just in an order of grace and for church teaching, but in the order of nature. They have a spiritual authority and a spiritual headship in the home. And if that's hardly exercised, a child's not going to really imbibe the faith, even if they've learned it in all these third-party means, schools or the churches or whatnot. But one of the things I see more and more too are priests withdrawing more and more from their roles in the church. Now, generally, I think one of the reasons why Catholic men falter generally, and I mean grown men, is that the priests aren't leading them or are really healthfully engaged with them. When I was a kid, I think the priests showed up for most of the meetings. They were more present. Now, I think it's been many years, even past my generation, of priests withdrawn for their educative role. In other words, priests are supposed to be teaching. And now sometimes you have more conscientious and even traditionalist kind of parishes and whatnot. The priests are involved in formation and confirmation, other things. They're doing a lot of the teaching. So I think authorities need to be teaching. A priest need to be teaching, and he needs to be training fathers that really, hey, I'm not the spiritual head of the home, you are. I'm not the spiritual teacher of your children, you are. Not that he's in some ways he's the secondary, but the father of the home is the primary educator of the faith. the mother will be doing more of it. But he's more primarily responsible. And I think what's happened is Catholic parents, and Christian parents generally, they're not really being charged to this fundamental office of what is to teach and to bestow, what is to live in Christ with their children more directly and do it in a very authoritative way. And I think too, and this isn't to be disparaging about wives and mothers, but more and more as I work with men, I think we're in a transition where women are being less and less deferential to their husbands. And so the children are not seeing an example of obedience and what is to submit and what is to yield and defer to a husband's leadership. And faith, we have to remember, is primarily learned by authority, at least definitely with children. We don't imbibe it because of a good argument. Especially as children, we imbibe the faith from authority. And above all, that authority needs to be in a primal way in the father in the home. So with that, Chuck, let's close here and let's pick this up next time. Glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit. As in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the Men's Academy YouTube channel. You can also find us at themensacademy.org and donate there if you feel so moved. God bless.